The perfect facade of the Russell family. To the casual observer, the Russell family represented the peak of suburban success in modern America. Nestled in a picturesque neighborhood just outside Los Angeles, their home, a sprawling mid-century modern estate adorned with a meticulously manicured lawn, was the envy of all. Vincent Russell, a highly regarded corporate attorney with a near-perfect win record, and his wife Amelia Russell, a celebrated chef and the owner of a thriving restaurant chain, seemed to have mastered that elusive balance between professional accomplishments and family harmony. Amelia, with her signature red lipstick and endless charisma, was frequently spotted hosting charity galas or attending culinary expos across the country. Magazine features dubbed her the modern Julia Child, applauding her business acumen and down-to-earth charm. Meanwhile, Vincent was the epitome of the successful lawyer, besuited, decisive, and always a step ahead of his competition. His name was a staple in Forbes's top attorneys to watch lists, and clients lined up for the chance to have him represent them in high-stakes deals. Together they exuded sophistication, a power couple who seemed to have it all. The Russells weren't just wealthy, they knew how to display their good fortune in just the right way. Their home, a frequent location for fundraisers and social events, boasted high glass ceilings, an infinity pool overlooking rolling California hills, and a wine cellar stocked with rare vintages. Their daughter, Emily, was an A student attending an elite private school, where she excelled in academics, equestrian sports, and piano recitals. Neighbors described the Russell family as storybook perfect. They were the kind of family you'd see in glossy brochures or lifestyle blogs. Walking their purebred golden retriever through the peaceful streets, or arriving at events in their custom Tesla, they seemed like the embodiment of the American dream, a curated image of success, love, and happiness that others could only strive to emulate. But perfection, as they say, can be suffocating. Behind closed doors, Amelia struggled with the pressure to maintain that flawless exterior while running a growing business empire. Vincent, though devoted to his career, grew increasingly distant, his long hours and frequent business trips testing the foundation of their marriage. Whispers of tension began circulating within the tight-knit social circles of their wealthy enclave. Was the perfect family starting to crack? Few could have guessed that beneath their glittering exterior lurked simmering resentments, hidden betrayals, and a plan so dangerous it would unravel everything they had worked to build. This was no ordinary suburban family, this was a ticking time bomb waiting for the right spark to ignite. The crumbling marriage. On the surface, Vincent and Amelia Russell's marriage seemed almost too good to be true. A polished union spotlighted by high-profile careers and a shared love for their daughter Emily. To those gazing through the proverbial rose-colored glasses from the outside, their relationship looked like a portrait of stability, passion, and mutual respect. But beneath the surface, the cracks that had been quietly forming for years began to widen, ultimately threatening to tear apart the delicate fabric of their picture-perfect life. It all started subtly at first, almost imperceptibly. Vincent's work obligations grew heavier, and with each new high-powered client or million-dollar contract he found himself spending more nights away, locked in meetings or stuck in luxury conference rooms far from home. Amelia, for her part, continued to pour her heart into her burgeoning restaurant chain, often working late into the night perfecting her menu or strategizing with business consultants. The once vibrant dinner conversations they'd shared in the early years of their marriage were now reduced to brief exchanges over emails or text messages. It wasn't just the schedules to blame, there was something deeper, something unspoken but tangible. Amelia couldn't help but notice Vincent's growing disengagement during their rare moments together. His laughter, once genuine and infectious, now felt forced. He had started checking his phone constantly even during family movie nights with Emily. And then, there were the unexplained absences. The last-minute business trips that didn't seem to add up, the mysterious phone calls he excused himself to take in the other room. Trust, the cornerstone of their once strong bond, started to waver the day Amelia found an unfamiliar perfume lingering faintly on Vincent's tailored suits. She told herself it was nothing, that she was overthinking or being paranoid. But intuition is a stubborn beast. Over time, small clues began to piece together a disturbing possibility. There were late-night texts arriving on his phone while he was in the shower, brief smiles he tried to hide whenever his screen lit up. Amelia watched, silently, as her husband drifted further into a world she wasn't a part of. One night, unable to suppress her turmoil, she decided to confront him. Vincent had just returned home from a week-long trip to New York. As usual, he looked exhausted but polished, his leather briefcase sitting neatly by the front door. As they sat on opposite ends of their grand marble dining table, she asked in a calm yet pointed tone, "Vincent, are you seeing someone else?" He froze for a moment, his hand gripping the edge of his glass just a little too tightly. "What? Amelia, that's ridiculous! Why would you even ask that?" His voice carried indignation, but his eyes betrayed him with a flicker of guilt. Amelia stared at him, her expression unreadable. "Maybe because you haven't really been here, Vincent. Not for me, not for Emily. You're always working, always on your phone. Do you even know when the last time we had dinner as a family was?" Her voice cracked, revealing the hurt she had carefully piled up for months, if not years. Vincent ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, frustrated but unwilling to meet her gaze. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under. The deals I'm closing, the clients, they expect me to be available at all hours. It's not just about me, Amelia, it's for us, for our family." But Amelia wasn't buying it anymore. "So are 2 a.m. text messages and perfume that smells like it came straight out of a department store for us too?" She shot back, tears threatening to spill over. The argument escalated, drawing out years of repressed anger and feelings of alienation. Vincent accused Amelia of being overly controlling, obsessed with her work and neglecting their marriage. Amelia fired back, claiming his long absences and lack of emotional intimacy had pushed her away. Neither could recall how the conversation ended, but by the time Vincent retreated to the guest room, it was clear their relationship had suffered irreversible damage. In the days that followed, neither made an effort to reconcile. They lived like strangers under the same roof, their lives mechanically revolving around Emily, who remained blissfully unaware of the tension simmering between her parents. Amelia threw herself even harder into her work, creating the outward illusion that everything was fine. She smiled at gala dinners and posed for photos, but sleepless nights began to take their toll, lingering in the form of dark circles and weary eyes. As Vincent continued to distance himself, something inside Amelia had begun to snap. Perhaps it was the betrayal she suspected but couldn't quite prove. Or maybe it was years of suppressing her own desires and goals to fit the mold of the perfect wife. In her darkest moments, she caught herself wondering what would happen if she could simply erase Vincent from her life altogether. It was a dangerous thought, one she forced herself to push away every time it crept into her mind. But dangerous thoughts have a way of lingering, don't they? Quietly, insidiously. Amelia began to confide in Jacob Dawson, an old college friend turned confidant. Over glasses of wine in her luxurious kitchen, she poured out her frustrations, her anger, her pain. Jacob listened, his presence a stark contrast to Vincent's cold indifference. What at first felt like harmless venting soon turned into whispered conspiracy, first as a joke, then as something more real. While Vincent believed his world was firmly in order, a life compartmentalized between family and his secret affair, he was oblivious to the storm brewing behind him. Amelia wasn't just hurt anymore. She was planning, and that plan was about to change everything. A masterful plan. Amelia Russell was not the sort of woman to simply let life happen to her. She had built her career, her family, and her reputation with relentless drive and an unflinching determination to succeed. But now her perfect world was shattering, and the betrayal she felt, deep, personal, and raw, was consuming her every thought. Amelia knew she couldn't let Vincent walk away unscathed, and more importantly, that she couldn't let him keep control of everything they had built together. If he was going to betray her, she would make sure he paid the ultimate price. It began as a seed, a small thought that bloomed in the dark corners of her mind late at night as she stared at the ceiling of their lavish bedroom. Divorce, she surmised bitterly, wasn't enough. Divorce was messy, loud, and it would leave them both torn apart in the media. Worse, Vincent had the advantage. His legal expertise, his carefully managed finances, his airtight contracts. She could already picture the courtroom, the smug corporate attorneys he would hire, the arguments that would paint her as emotional or distracted by her career. No, she couldn't let this end in a courtroom. Winning was about control, and Amelia needed a way to not only win, but strip Vincent of everything. That's when she thought of Jacob Dawson. Jacob was an old college friend, charming, rugged in a boy-next-door way, but more importantly, loyal. Their relationship had always been strictly platonic during their college years, but Jacob's dry wit and quiet intensity had stood out to Amelia even back then. After graduating, they had continued to exchange sporadic messages, though their lives had taken vastly different paths. Amelia rose to fame as a chef and entrepreneur. Jacob, once a police officer with a promising career, had been dismissed from the force due to corruption allegations. His life had spiraled from there, odd jobs, debt, and finally, a move to Nevada, where he now lived in relative obscurity. It was early one morning, over her second cup of coffee and hours of sleepless scheming, that Amelia realized Jacob might be exactly the person she needed. He had the skill set, the knowledge of the legal system, and perhaps most importantly, a gray morality that she could manipulate. She picked up her phone and dialed his number. "Amelia? Damn, it's been a while," Jacob answered, his voice gruffer than she remembered. "It has," Amelia replied, keeping her tone light and casual. "Listen, Jacob, I was hoping to catch up. I'm coming out to Nevada for a weekend soon. Can I buy you a drink?" Jacob chuckled on the other end. "You? Driving all the way out here to catch up with a nobody like me? Color me intrigued. Sure, why not?" Amelia wasn't driving out to Nevada to catch up. This was about planting a seed of her own. A week later, as Jacob sat across from her in a dimly lit bar outside Reno, she painted herself as the picture of heartbreak. She told him about Vincent's long nights, the perfume she couldn't identify, the cold distance that had crept into their marriage. Jacob listened, beer in hand, his brow furrowed. "That bastard doesn't deserve you," he said finally, his tone brimming with indignation. "Some people just don't know how good they have it." Amelia took a sip of her wine, her eyes locking onto Jacob's. "You're right," she said softly. "He doesn't, and I'm not going to let him take me down with him." Jacob tilted his head. "What are you saying, Amelia?" She hesitated, carefully crafting her words. "I'm saying he's left me no choice. He's hidden assets, Jacob, $1 million assets. If we divorce, he'll tear me to pieces in court. But if he was removed from the picture?" She let the question hang in the air. Jacob's eyes narrowed. "Amelia, are you talking about—" "I'm not talking about anything, yet," she interrupted, leaning closer and lowering her voice. "But hypothetically, if I needed help, the kind of help only someone with your background could provide, would you?" There was a long silence. Finally, Jacob leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "You're playing with fire, Amelia." Her lips curled into a faint smile. "I know." What began as a hypothetical soon transformed into a carefully laid plan. Over the next several weeks, Amelia kept in constant contact with Jacob, framing him as her confidant while quietly pulling him deeper into her web. She appealed to his sense of loyalty, his lingering feelings for their old friendship, and perhaps even the remnants of his pride, bruised as they were by his tarnished career. By the time she laid out the full scope of her plan, Jacob was already hooked. Vincent, she explained, would be lured into a seamless trap. Amelia had access to his itinerary, and she knew he had a business trip to Las Vegas coming up. Jacob would pose as a taxi driver, intercept Vincent at the airport, and abduct him on the way to his hotel. The beauty of the plan lay in its simplicity. Vincent would vanish, and so would his assets. "What about after?" Jacob asked one evening as they finalized the details in a late-night phone call. "He'll stay missing," Amelia replied curtly. "Somewhere remote. Quiet. He won't have a chance to fight back or explain himself. Meanwhile, I'll play the grieving wife. Police will believe every word I say. After all, why wouldn't they? Everyone loves Amelia Russell." Jacob hesitated. "And if something goes wrong?" "It won't!" Amelia snapped. "We're smarter than him. We're smarter than everyone." The week leading up to Vincent's disappearance felt surreal to Amelia. She went about her daily routines, running her restaurants, attending Emily's school events, and hosting fundraisers, all with the confidence of someone whose every move was rehearsed. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. Amelia felt the weight of what she was about to do creeping into her chest late at night, threatening to suffocate her. Was she prepared to destroy the man she had once loved? She pushed the thought aside each time it surfaced. This wasn't about love anymore. It was about survival, power, and control. As the day of the plan arrived, Amelia and Jacob coordinated one last time. "You have everything you need?" she asked, her voice measured. Jacob nodded on the video call. "Yeah, don't worry, Amelia, everything's set. You'll get what you want." "I always do," she replied, her lips curling into a faint smile. What Amelia didn't realize, however, was that no plan, no matter how masterful, was ever truly foolproof, and the choices she had made would soon spiral far beyond her control. Staging the kidnapping. The night of the plan was illuminated by the soft hum of Las Vegas's neon glow, the perfect backdrop for an unsuspecting Vincent Russell to walk straight into the trap his wife had meticulously designed. Amelia had been preparing for this moment for weeks, each detail fine-tuned, each contingency considered. This wasn't just a reaction to betrayal. For Amelia, this was a performance, a calculated chess move, where she would never need to dirty her hands directly. And Jacob Dawson? He was her perfect pawn. Jacob's rusted yellow cab looked no different from the dozens of other taxis lined up along the terminal at McCarran International Airport. Its slightly scratched paint, air freshener swinging from the rearview mirror, and erratic engine hum gave the car an authenticity that no one, especially an exhausted business executive like Vincent, would second-guess. Jacob had meticulously prepared the interior, a handful of empty fast food wrappers scattered on the passenger seat, and a stash of energy drink cans to perfect his sleep-deprived, overworked cabbie persona. To everyone outside the terminal, he was just another driver trying to make ends meet. Inside his suitcase, however, lay the tools of a very different trade, a roll of duct tape, plastic ties, and a taser. Jacob ran through the scenario in his head as he waited in the airport's pickup line, glancing at his burner phone. "This is it," he muttered to himself, pulling his baseball cap lower to obscure his face from any cameras. Meanwhile, Amelia was already back home in Los Angeles, playing her part of the devoted wife to perfection. As Vincent boarded his plane earlier that day, she had kissed him goodbye on their front porch with a forced but convincing smile, reassuring him that she would handle Emily's upcoming piano recital while he was away. "Don't worry about us," she said sweetly. "We've got it all under control." She waved as his Uber pulled away, the car slowly vanishing around the corner. Her serene, suburban facade cracked the moment she shut the door. With one long exhale, she allowed herself a fleeting moment of emotion before returning to the task at hand. Amelia double-checked everything, her alibi, her call logs, her staged text conversations where she worried about Vincent arriving safely. She then deleted the messages, leaving conscious gaps for investigators to later discover. Back at the airport, Vincent strolled out of the terminal, his sharp black suit just slightly wrinkled from the flight. He glanced at his phone, noting a flurry of work emails from his assistant. His brow furrowed as he tapped quickly on the screen. Vincent was a man who lived to keep moving, always one more call, one more deal, one more step up the ladder. He rarely noticed the small, sticky details of life because, to him, productivity left no room for distraction. He looked up briefly and spotted the yellow cab pulling up right in front of him. "Russell?" Jacob called out, reading the placard he clearly wrote in bold marker. Vincent nodded, waving casually. Dragging his leather travel bag behind him, he climbed into the back seat, already resuming his one-sided work conversation over his AirPods. He barely looked up from his phone. Jacob grinned to himself. This was going to be easier than he thought. The cab pulled smoothly away from the curb, blending seamlessly into a stream of vehicles leaving the airport. The radio played softly, classic rock muffled by the hum of traffic outside. Jacob stole a glance at Vincent through the rear-view mirror. The man was completely preoccupied with his phone, his eyes glued to a screen as though the world outside didn't exist. "So, you heading to the Venetian, right?" Jacob asked casually, affecting his best tired but friendly cabbie tone. "Yeah," Vincent responded, hardly looking up. "Quickest route, please." Jacob nodded, taking a long turn onto an adjacent highway. Not a suspicious deviation, just enough of a change in course to set everything into motion. As the car moved further away from the bright lights of the strip and into quieter, darker roads, Vincent finally noticed. His phone momentarily forgotten. He glanced out the window, frowning. "This doesn't look like the way to the Venetian," he said, his tone sharp and suspicious now. Jacob shrugged, his grip on the wheel tightening slightly. "Don't worry, man, just rerouting around some traffic. You know how it is." Vincent's frown deepened as the cityscape vanished behind them, swallowed by the shadows of industrial warehouses and vacant lots. Something didn't feel right. He slid his phone into his pocket, his professional instincts kicking in. "Hey listen," he started, "if this is the scenic route, just turn around, I don't have time for this." Jacob didn't respond. "Seriously," Vincent repeated, a threat of panic creeping into his voice. "What's going on here?" The taser buzzed before he could finish his sentence, its electric hum slicing through the tense air. There was no warning, no exchange of threats, only the sharp jolt of pain and the sound of Vincent's body convulsing before he collapsed against the leather seat. Jacob pulled off the road and parked the cab behind an abandoned auto repair shop, breathing heavily as he glanced back at Vincent's unconscious form. "Sorry, buddy," he muttered under his breath. "It's not personal." Working quickly, Jacob pulled out the duct tape and plastic ties, securing Vincent's hands and feet with precision. He then slipped a black hood over Vincent's head and dragged his limp body out of the car. Despite his smaller stature, Jacob moved with surprising ease, Years of physical training made such maneuvers second nature to him. The journey to the cabin was slow and deliberate. Jacob followed a pre-selected, carefully planned route mapped out by Amelia herself. The cabin was some 2 hours outside of Las Vegas, nestled deep in the Nevada desert, surrounded by miles of barren nothingness. It was the perfect spot, quiet and isolated, far removed from the reach of curious neighbors or law enforcement. The abandoned cabin looked like it hadn't seen life in years. Its sagging roof and cracked wood panels made it appear worthless to anyone who might stumble upon it. But inside, Amelia and Jacob had equipped it with everything they'd need. A folding chair bolted to the floor, heavy chains, water bottles, non-perishable snacks. It was all there, ready to stage Vincent's captivity. When Vincent finally stirred, his first sensation was a blinding headache and the tight, stifling feeling of duct tape cutting into his skin. As consciousness returned in fragments, he became dimly aware of his surroundings. The musty smell of the cabin air, the rough texture of the hood scraping against his nose. Panic set in as he struggled uselessly against the restraints. "Don't bother," Jacob's voice rang out low and steady. "You're not going anywhere." Vincent's muffled protests were ignored as Jacob leaned back against the wall, his demeanor calm and almost casual. For him, this wasn't personal. It was just another job. To Vincent, it was the beginning of a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Amelia's phone rang at that exact moment back in Los Angeles. She picked up immediately, her tone calm yet eager. "It's done," Jacob said simply on the other end. "Good," Amelia replied, letting a small, cold smile spread across her lips. This was no longer a marriage falling apart, this was war. The perfect performance. Amelia Russell had always been a master at persuasion. As a celebrated chef and business mogul, she'd charmed investors, journalists, and television audiences for years with her disarming smile, sharp wit, and ability to make even the most complex situations appear effortless. But now, Amelia wasn't just playing to please an audience, she was crafting a performance so perfect, so utterly believable, that no one would ever suspect the horrors unfolding behind the scenes. For Amelia, this was the role of her lifetime. The day after Vincent's disappearance, Amelia walked into the Los Angeles Police Department, visibly distraught. Her usually immaculate appearance, a staple at every public event, was intentionally softened. Her makeup appeared hastily applied, her hair swept up in a loose bun with strands falling out of place. There were faint smudges under her eyes, which she achieved by carefully smearing a light line of eyeliner before arriving to create the appearance of sleeplessness. The police officer at the front desk took one look at her and instantly softened his tone. "Yes, ma'am, how can I help you?" Amelia's lip quivered as she spoke. "It's my husband, he's missing. He was supposed to be in Las Vegas yesterday for a business trip, but—" Her voice cracked, practiced but utterly convincing. "But he never contacted me when he landed. I can't reach his phone. No one has seen him. Please, you have to help." Back at home, her living room had been transformed into what she called the tragedy zone. The lights were dimmed slightly, and framed photos of her and Vincent, professionally staged ones from their family photo shoots, were propped up on side tables. Her coffee table was covered with tissues, some purposefully crumpled to appear used. A forgotten cup of tea sat cold near the edge, placed there solely to enhance the illusion of her grief-ridden distraction. She made sure the press got wind of her anguish early. Amelia feigned reluctance during her first interview with a local news affiliate, her voice shaking as she spoke directly to the camera. "Please," she pleaded, her hands wringing with desperation. "If anyone has seen my husband Vincent Russell, please call the authorities immediately. He's my whole world, and we just want him home." The journalist wore the kind of sympathetic frown they must practice in the mirror. "Mrs. Russell, is there any reason you think someone might want to hurt him? Did he have—" The reporter hesitated, softening the question. "Any enemies?" Amelia dabbed her eyes with a tissue and shook her head. "Vincent is—" She paused, almost imperceptibly, to let the emotional weight of her words fill the silence. "He's a good man, a wonderful father. His work in corporate law can be stressful, but I don't think—" Her voice caught in her throat. "I don't think anyone would ever do something like this." Every detail was choreographed. The slow blink that signaled her composure breaking, the delicate tremble in her bottom lip that reinforced her sorrow. She was devastated, heartbroken, inconsolable, and the entire world bought it. Meanwhile, Jacob Dawson stayed hidden, just as they had planned. Deep in the remoteness of the Nevada desert, he confined Vincent in a dilapidated cabin fit only for this sinister purpose. Jacob played his role too, though far less polished than Amelia's theatrics. His job was simple: keep Vincent alive but untraceable. Jacob checked in periodically through the prepaid burner phone he and Amelia had agreed upon. No names were used, and each call lasted less than 30 seconds. "I need more water," Jacob said flatly during one of their brief exchanges. "You already have enough," Amelia replied with an edge of irritation in her voice. "I'm not asking for an opinion," Jacob muttered, lowering his voice as he glanced at Vincent, who sat immobilized in the corner of the room. "The guy sweats like crazy. This desert isn't a goddamn spa." A long silence followed before Amelia responded firmly. "Just handle it. You get paid when I get results." And she did get results. Within 48 hours, her phone calls and TV appearances had escalated the case into a full-blown media frenzy. The words "missing million-dollar attorney" blared across headlines. Neighbors, business acquaintances, even competitors, all were eager to chime in about how wonderful Vincent had been, how perfect Amelia was, and how deeply tragic the situation seemed. Each person fed into her narrative without even realizing it. To the authorities, Amelia played up her vulnerability while maintaining just enough composure to seem cooperative. She answered every question with careful precision, claiming to recall minor details that could paint her as helpful, but still too shocked to think clearly. "When did you last hear from your husband, Mrs. Russell?" Her voice broke as she answered. It was the morning he left. He kissed Emily goodbye and said he'd call when he landed." "Did you notice anything unusual about his behavior before he left? Was he worried? Nervous?" "Not unusual," she said, pausing as if searching her memory. "He was busier than usual recently, worried about work, but Vincent always worked so hard for our family." At one point, when detectives asked for access to Vincent's emails and financial records, she appeared momentarily hesitant, a brief pause that felt entirely authentic. Finally she exhaled deeply, as though summoning every ounce of courage she had, and said, "Whatever it takes to bring him home." The delay wasn't an accident. It was carefully planned to create the illusion of a wife reluctant to invade her husband's privacy, further cementing her performance as the grieving spouse. Even Emily, their 13-year-old daughter, wasn't immune to Amelia's elaborate scheme. Although Amelia spared Emily from hearing the darker truths, she coached her to speak emotionally when concerned family friends or police officers dropped by the house. "Just tell them Daddy's coming back soon," Amelia would say with a gentle stroke of her hair. To Emily, who idolized her father, the only truth she understood was uncertainty. She wasn't acting, but Amelia was skilled enough to manipulate her into becoming an unwitting supporting player in her drama. Behind closed doors, Amelia prepared herself for the next stage in her performance, the ransom note. But this wouldn't be any ordinary plea for cash. She planned to demand $3 million, not from her own finances but from Vincent's frozen accounts. She would tell police it was proof he'd been targeted for jealousy or corporate revenge, ensuring that law enforcement continued chasing shadows instead of looking closer at her. As she finished typing the fake ransom email on a disposable laptop, Amelia smiled faintly. Each word, each phrase, was curated to draw attention away from herself. The email described anonymous captors claiming to have control over her husband, as well as explicit instructions for payment. She added just the right touch of desperation, closing with, "Act quickly, nobody wants blood on their hands." She hit send, knowing full well the chaos it would unleash. What Amelia didn't account for, however, was the unpredictability of others. Despite her careful staging, cracks would inevitably form in her flawless performance, and when they did, everything she had meticulously constructed would come crashing down. For now, though, she poured herself a glass of wine, leaned back in her chair, and basked in the temporary triumph of her perfect deception. Adaptive tactics. Amelia prided herself on being a woman who could pivot under pressure. She had learned long ago that life rarely followed a perfect script, and anyone who reached her level of success had to be prepared for the unexpected. Whether it was reinventing a failing menu at her flagship restaurant on the fly, or negotiating a deal with a stubborn investor, Amelia Russell always found a way to adapt. This time, however, the stakes were higher than anything she'd ever faced. And as the days ticked by with Vincent still in captivity, cracks began to form in her meticulously crafted plan. The first sign of trouble came from Jacob Dawson. As Amelia sat in her lavish, modern kitchen, sipping her third cappuccino of the morning, her burner phone buzzed with his number. She answered quickly, her voice sharp and controlled. "What is it?" she asked, barely masking her irritation. She already hated speaking to Jacob. Every conversation with him risked exposing the weak link in her otherwise airtight scheme. Jacob's raspy voice crackled through the line. "We've got a problem. Vincent's not cooperating." Amelia set her cup down a little too forcefully, the ceramic rattling against the marble counter. "What do you mean, not cooperating? He's tied up in a cabin in the middle of the desert. What exactly do you expect him to be doing?" Jacob sighed, and she could almost picture him running his hand through his unkempt hair. "Look, Amelia, it's not about restraint. He's been screaming his lungs out, okay? And someone's gonna hear him eventually, even out here. I had to gag him." "Fine," Amelia said dismissively. "Do what you have to do. Just keep him under control. This is exactly why I brought you in, so I wouldn't have to deal with this kind of thing." "Yeah, well, it's starting to feel like I'm doing all the work here," Jacob muttered bitterly. "You're sitting pretty in your mansion while I'm out here babysitting your asshole husband." Amelia froze for a moment, her jaw tightening. "You knew what you signed up for, Jacob. I'm paying you more than you've seen in a decade to fix this problem. So unless you want to walk away empty-handed, I suggest you figure it out." The line went dead after her cold dismissal, but the frustration lingered in the air. Jacob was becoming a liability, and Amelia knew she'd have to tread carefully. He had skills, yes, but he was also reckless, unpredictable, and growing increasingly resentful. Still, she had no choice but to rely on him for now. The second obstacle came not from Jacob or Vincent directly, but from the police. Though Amelia had spent days charming investigators and deflecting their questions, she couldn't ignore the growing intensity of their interest. The Los Angeles Police Department had brought in digital forensic teams to analyze the ransom email, and while Amelia had taken every precaution to send the message from an anonymous disposable laptop, she wasn't naive enough to believe it made her untouchable. One morning, Detective Michael Graves arrived at her door unannounced. A tall, imposing man with a steely gaze, Graves radiated the kind of quiet authority that made most people fidget under his scrutiny. But not Amelia. She met him at the door in her silk robe, her hair slightly mussed to suggest she hadn't slept well. "Detective Graves," she greeted him with a faint, weary smile. "I take it you have news about Vincent." Graves tilted his head slightly as if trying to gauge her sincerity. "Not exactly, Mrs. Russell. I just have a few follow-up questions. Do you mind if I come in?" Amelia gestured for him to enter, her movements calm and controlled. Inside the house, she'd carefully maintained the atmosphere of a grieving wife's sanctuary. Family photos were positioned just so. A half-empty glass of wine rested on the coffee table, and the faint smell of her lavender-scented candles hung in the air. "Of course," she said, ushering him toward the living room. "Anything to help find Vincent." The questions started out simple. Where had Vincent been traveling to? Did he mention anyone suspicious at work? But Graves, Amelia quickly realized, wasn't playing the same game as the other officers. His eyes lingered on her reactions a fraction too long, his tone probing rather than empathetic. The man wasn't here to console her, he was here to test her. When Graves asked for access to her emails once again, Amelia hesitated just long enough to elicit suspicion. "I already told your colleague," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "that I don't feel comfortable going through Vincent's private messages. Isn't that invasive?" "Mrs. Russell, I understand this is difficult," Graves said, his voice soft but unrelenting. "But in these situations, even the smallest clue can make all the difference. A single email could lead us to the people who did this." Amelia forced a tear to slide down her cheek as she nodded. "You're right," she whispered. "Anything to bring him home." But as she handed over her laptop, she could feel the walls closing in. They were getting too close. Faced with mounting pressure, Amelia knew she had to adjust her tactics. The ransom email had already given the police something to focus on, a faceless villain demanding millions of dollars. But she needed to exploit it further. That night, sitting alone in her bedroom with the hotel-style bedding meticulously undisturbed, she crafted a second email, this time suggesting that Vincent's disappearance wasn't random. "We know who your husband is. This isn't about money, it's about revenge. You think he's untouchable? Think again. If you don't pay up, he'll never make it out alive." Amelia smiled faintly as she read over her work. The veiled threat against Vincent's reputation would further confuse the investigation, implicating his own powerful corporate enemies. But more importantly, it would shift the spotlight away from her. Meanwhile, Jacob was growing restless. His calls became more frequent, each one dripping with frustration. "I've been stuck in this godforsaken cabin for a week, Amelia," he hissed during one particularly heated exchange. "What's the plan here? I can't keep him forever." "You'll do what I tell you to do," Amelia snapped back, "and you'll do it until I decide we're finished." "That's easy for you to say," Jacob retorted. "You're not the one looking over your shoulder every 5 minutes. You're not the one dealing with—" Jacob's tirade was cut short when Vincent screamed something unintelligible in the background. The phone went silent for a moment before Jacob muttered, "I gotta go," and hung up. Amelia threw the burner phone onto her vanity, her heart racing. Jacob was unraveling faster than she anticipated, and it was only a matter of time before he made a reckless mistake. She needed to act quickly. For now, Amelia continued to play her role, doubling down on her public persona as a desperate, grieving wife. She gave tearful interviews, attended prayer vigils for Vincent, and even allowed reporters into her home to showcase the emptiness that lingered without her husband. To the outside world, she was a woman clinging to hope in the face of unimaginable loss, but behind closed doors, her carefully controlled world was slipping through her fingers, and as the noose tightened, Amelia began to realize that the most dangerous part of her plan wasn't the authorities or even Jacob. The real danger was time. Uncovering the suspicious clues. Detective Michael Graves had seen it all in his 20 years on the force. Fraudulent insurance claims, staged crimes, even families willing to sell out their loved ones for a quick payday. But there was something distinctly unsettling about the Russell case. It wasn't just the high-profile nature of it or the media firestorm, it was the nagging sense that the story Amelia was telling wasn't quite whole. Pieces didn't fit together. And when stories didn't fit, Graves knew to start pulling on loose threads until the whole thing unraveled. It started with the ransom emails. The first one had been well-crafted, almost too well-crafted. The phrasing was concise, the threats chilling enough to seem serious but vague enough to provide plausible deniability. The demands were high, $3 million wired to an untraceable offshore account, but something about it felt rehearsed, as if whoever wrote it had done their homework, but lacked authenticity. Graves sat in his cramped office staring at the glowing computer screen. His hand hovered over his coffee mug, now cold from hours of neglect. The digital forensic team hadn't turned up much, not yet anyway. They'd traced the email to an anonymous laptop purchased in cash and sent from a public Wi-Fi network at a coffee shop in downtown Los Angeles. Smart, Graves muttered to himself. Too smart. But not smart enough. There was a detail buried deep in the metadata of the email that flagged the team's attention. The IP address of the laptop had briefly been connected to a private network moments before the email was sent, a rookie mistake, and the private network just so happened to belong to Amelia Russell. Graves leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against his temple. "If it looks too perfect, it probably is," he said under his breath. After filing the discovery, Graves decided to pay Amelia another visit. He didn't confront her right away, it was too soon for that. Instead, he revisited her home, this time under the guise of a follow-up interview, and came prepared with more specific questions. Amelia welcomed him into her home with the same polished demeanor as before. She was dressed sharply in a fitted blazer and casual slacks, carefully curated to suggest propriety mixed with the fatigue of a grieving wife. Her makeup was subtler this time, just enough to appear natural yet polished, but she wasn't expecting Graves's poker face. "What can I do to help, Detective?" she asked sweetly, ushering him into the same perfectly staged living room. "That's the thing about these cases," Graves began conversationally, ignoring her question. "They're puzzles, and sometimes the smallest piece can make or break the whole picture." He studied her reaction as he spoke, noting how she sat down gracefully, crossing her legs in a controlled, deliberate motion. "Of course," she replied, clasping her hands in her lap. "Whatever I can do to help bring Vincent home." Graves nodded, acting as though her response wasn't rehearsed. "About the ransom email," he began slowly, watching her carefully. Amelia froze for just a moment, just long enough for Graves to notice, a slight stiffening of her shoulders before she quickly composed herself. "Yes? Did you find anything?" The detectives had found plenty. After digging deeper into her activity, investigators began noticing a troubling pattern. Amelia's phone data revealed she had been to a remote area near the Nevada desert just 2 weeks prior to Vincent's disappearance. She had no restaurants there, no family, no apparent reason to visit a location so secluded. The information was unsettling but not yet conclusive. Graves continued. "Mrs. Russell, did you ever travel outside of Los Angeles recently? Anywhere near Las Vegas, maybe?" Amelia hesitated, another faint crack slipping through her polished armor. "No," she said after a pause that felt a second too long. "My time has been consumed with work and Emily, as you know. I don't have time for weekend trips." Graves pressed further, leaning on his talent for reading body language. Interesting. Because we have cell tower records that indicate you were near the Nevada border. Probably close to fieldwork for one of your restaurants? Amelia smiled tightly, though there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Irritation? Fear? Well, she corrected herself, maybe I drove through the area a few weeks ago. I sometimes take road trips to clear my head, though I can't think of one that close to Las Vegas. She laughed lightly, dismissively, as though the notion was frivolous. That's funny, though. I must have forgotten. Forgotten. Graves scribbled the word in his notebook, even though he didn't believe her. What Amelia didn't know was that, by this point, the investigation had already advanced further than she realized. Earlier that week, the forensic team had reviewed traffic camera footage from various locations in Nevada. They hadn't just found her license plate, they had also spotted a rusted yellow taxi eerily similar to Jacob Dawson's old vehicle. It confirmed their growing suspicion. Amelia was connected to more than just a terrified, grieving family narrative. Something darker loomed beneath. Last question, Graves said casually, watching her like a hawk. Do you know a Jacob Dawson? An old friend, maybe? Amelia's smile froze mid-sentence, her hands clasped tighter around each other. Jacob? She repeated, feigning a moment of harmless confusion. I think... Jacob? The name sounds familiar. Maybe from college. She shrugged lightly, her voice intentionally even. But I haven't spoken to anyone from that far back in years. Is he someone suspicious? Now it was her turn to probe. Graves leaned forward, examining her as if she were a suspect in a lineup. Not yet, he said carefully. But if he pops back up, I'd let us know. Sometimes people come out of the woodwork during tragedies like this. Opportunists, you know. Amelia nodded mechanically, a smile painted across her face that didn't reach her eyes. As the detective left her house that day, she walked him to the door with the same charm she always wielded. But once she closed it behind him, the mask fell. Her carefully maintained composure fractured like glass slammed against the ground. Oh no, she whispered to herself, grasping the counter's edge to steady her trembling fingers. She knew the walls were closing in faster than she had ever prepared for. Graves, on the other hand, climbed into his car and let out a long breath. Pulling out his phone, he dialed the head of the investigation team. Keep digging, he ordered. She knows way more than she's letting on, and I think we're getting close. Pull every camera feed around Las Vegas from the week Vincent disappeared. If Jacob Dawson is involved, we'll find him. Graves hung up and started the engine, his chest tightening with a mix of determination and foreboding. He didn't have all the pieces yet, not yet. But he was closing in, and something about the case told him that once Amelia Russell's facade cracked, the truth was going to be uglier than he'd imagined. Mounting evidence. Detective Michael Graves had been patient, calculated, strategic, surgical in his methods. Still, patience only worked when the evidence didn't point directly at the motive, and in this case, it was practically screaming in his face. The Russell case wasn't just another high-profile kidnapping, it was something far more tangled, dark, and personal. And now, the mountain of evidence against Amelia Russell was starting to feel indisputable, like an avalanche that couldn't be stopped. Graves sat at his desk late one evening, the flicker of his computer screen the only light in the otherwise dark precinct. Files and papers were spread across his workspace, a patched-together tapestry of emails, financial records, surveillance footage, and timelines. He took another sip of his lukewarm coffee and leaned back in his chair, staring at one particular photo clipped to the edge of his laptop. Amelia Russell, looking poised as ever, delivering her tear-filled plea to the media for her husband's safe return. He hadn't bought it then. He wasn't buying it now. The breakthrough came when the traffic camera footage near the Nevada desert was cross-referenced with Vincent's travel details. The timestamps were a perfect match. The rusted yellow taxi spotted driving down a desolate stretch of road was registered under Jacob Dawson, a name Graves had already flagged after Amelia's less-than-convincing response during their last conversation. Graves could still hear her dismissive laugh in his head, that nervous little tick people had when they were hiding something. Gotcha, he muttered to himself. The footage alone wasn't enough. There was always the risk a sharp defense attorney could explain it away as coincidence. But Graves wasn't working with just one piece of evidence anymore. It was all starting to interlock. Cell tower records placed both Amelia and Jacob near the Nevada desert days before Vincent's disappearance. Surveillance from ATMs traced Amelia moving significant sums of money from her business accounts. Her alibi, while carefully crafted, began to crumble under careful scrutiny. The gap, those quiet 3 hours when no one could absolutely verify her whereabouts, was now glaring. And then there was the leak. Dawson wasn't exactly the most trustworthy henchman. As Graves had predicted, the pressure of babysitting a high-powered attorney in a sweltering, deserted cabin was too much for him to handle. At some point Dawson had slipped. A brief phone call to someone he owed money to, the kind of hurried conversation desperate people have. That phone call gave investigators the precise location they needed, a secluded, dilapidated cabin right outside Boulder City, Nevada. Graves's lips tightened into a grim smile. Things were escalating fast, and that was exactly what he wanted. The next step was calculated and carefully executed. A warrant was issued silently, and within hours, a specialized task force was mobilized. Their mission, to corner Jacob Dawson and safely recover Vincent Russell, hopefully alive. Graves coordinated the operation personally. One thing he couldn't risk was Amelia catching wind of their progress. She was clever, and clever people always had backup plans, the kind that could make key evidence disappear in seconds. By 3 a.m., the task force descended upon the cabin under the cover of darkness. Helicopter rotors hummed faintly overhead, nearly inaudible against the wind sweeping across the desert. Graves stayed back in a command van, listening to the live tactical feed through his earpiece. His heart pounded as the forces moved into position. "Unit 1, visual on the cabin," came the whispered voice of the team leader. "Suspect confirmed inside. We have movement." "Proceed," Graves responded, gripping the edge of the console desk as if he could feel the tension of the moment through the cold metal beneath his fingertips. The operation unfolded like a perfectly rehearsed scene. Tactical officers breached the cabin door with a loud crack, their flashlights slicing through the pitch-black interior. Jacob Dawson barely had time to react. Within seconds he was restrained and on the ground, cursing loudly, his face pressed to the creaky wooden floorboards. "Clear!" one of the officers called out. A second officer discovered Vincent slumped in a corner of the room, his wrists and ankles bound, face covered in sweat and exhaustion. He was alive, barely. Graves closed his eyes for half a second, letting out a long breath of relief. Hours later, as Vincent was being airlifted to a hospital, Jacob Dawson sat in an interrogation room, his face pale and visibly furious. Graves wasn't surprised. The man looked like stress incarnate, a cracked, unstable shell of the confident ex-police officer he might have once been. It didn't take long to get him to talk. People like Jacob weren't loyal, they were transactional, and when the transaction turned sour, they burned any bridges that might save their ass. "All right, Jacob," Graves said, sitting across from him with his usual steely calmness. "We've got you on kidnapping, extortion, and God knows how many other charges. That little phone call alone—" Graves tapped the file in front of him. "That's enough to bury you." Jacob leaned back in his chair, glaring at the detective with bloodshot eyes. "If you already know everything, what the hell do you need me to talk for?" Graves smirked. "Because, Jacob, the difference between 20 years and life in prison is whether or not you cooperate. So how about you tell us who put you up to this?" There was a long moment of silence. Jacob's jaw tightened, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. Finally he broke. "Amelia," he muttered, almost spitting her name. "It was her idea, all of it." Graves raised an eyebrow, feigning mild surprise. "Keep talking." "She called me out of the blue," Jacob continued, his voice dripping with resentment. "Said she wanted Vincent gone, said she could cut me a good payout if I kept him locked away long enough for her to rearrange his finances. She even made it sound easy." He let out a bitter laugh. "Like I could just clean up the mess after." Graves leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the table. "Did she say why?" Jacob shook his head. "Does it matter? The woman's a sociopath. She probably smiles at herself in the mirror before planning crap like this." Graves didn't flinch. He didn't need Jacob's commentary to confirm what he already suspected. Amelia Russell had architected this entire spiraling disaster to seize control of her husband's empire, and it was unraveling faster than she could possibly manage. When Graves left the interrogation room, he was greeted by one of his junior officers carrying new evidence, a series of falsified financial documents found on a hidden drive in Amelia's home office. Graves flipped through them, his anger palpable. She had tried to move Vincent's assets into offshore accounts, signing documents in his name, even forging emails to bank officials. It was messy, amateurish, desperate. Graves tucked the file under his arm and headed straight to his car. Amelia might have thought she'd outsmarted everyone, but every brilliant plan eventually hit a wall when arrogance overruled caution. Graves couldn't wait to watch hers come crashing down. A dramatic rescue. The rescue mission unfolded like the climax of a high-stakes thriller. As the pre-dawn air hung heavy over the Nevada desert, the task force moved in silence. Their convoy of unmarked black SUVs stopped a half-mile away from the dilapidated cabin where Vincent Russell was believed to be held. It was the kind of place no one would stumble upon by accident, a forgotten relic in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nature's indifference to life and death. Detective Michael Graves stood outside the lead vehicle, his eyes fixed on the faintest sliver of light glowing from the cabin's single grimy window. The humid night clung to his skin, but Graves barely noticed. His mind was on the operation ahead. Every decision, every mistake, was on his shoulders now. "Team 1, confirm position," Graves said into his earpiece, his voice steady but sharp. "Team 1 in position," a voice replied. "North sector clear." "Team 2?" Graves asked. "Team 2, ready on the east perimeter." Graves glanced at the tactical map spread across the hood of a vehicle. The entire area was a smattering of dirt roads, cacti, and scattered hills. There was no room for error out here. The isolation worked in their favor, but it also meant they couldn't summon immediate backup if things went south. All the evidence, cell tower pings, traffic cameras, and Jacob Dawson's phone call to his creditor, led to this cabin. It was the critical piece of a puzzle Amelia Russell had worked so hard to hide. Graves exhaled slowly, his hand brushing over the handgun at his hip. Inside that cabin could be Vincent Russell, possibly dead, and if he was still alive, Graves wasn't about to let bureaucracy slow him down. "All units," he said through his comms, his voice calm but firm, "go loud in 60 seconds, on my mark." Inside the cabin, Jacob Dawson paced back and forth, his nerves stretched thin after more than a week of babysitting Vincent Russell. Sweat clung to his shirt despite the cool desert night, every creak of the wooden floor, every burst of wind rattling the cabin's loose window panes, it all felt like a warning that time was running out. "Shut up!" Jacob barked without looking, waving the revolver in his hand behind him. Vincent, tied to a chair bolted to the floor, had barely made a sound, but Jacob could sense the man's defiance even in silence. Vincent's head lifted weakly. His hair was matted to his forehead, his lips dry and cracked. He was exhausted, dehydrated, but his mind was sharp enough to calculate what was happening. He couldn't see Jacob's face clearly through the haze of pain and dim light, but he could hear the desperation in his voice. Desperate men were dangerous, but they were also careless. "Dawson," Vincent said hoarsely, his voice barely above a whisper, his tongue stuck to his teeth as he forced out the words. "She's not coming, you know." Jacob froze mid-step, his grip tightening on the revolver. "What the hell are you talking about?" Vincent's cracked lips curled into the faintest trace of a bitter smile. "Amelia, she's playing you too. You think she's gonna share the payout with you? She'll let you take the fall while she walks away clean. You were always just part of the plan." Jacob's face contorted with anger, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. His pacing turned erratic, the floor creaking heavily under his boots as Vincent leaned back in his chair, his breathing labored but steady. Every word he spoke now was a gamble, a desperate attempt to distract Jacob long enough for something. Anything. Outside the cabin, the countdown hit 0. The task force's breach went off with military precision. The sound of the door exploding inward shattered the stillness of the early morning desert. Flashbang grenades detonated inside, filling the cabin with searing light and deafening sound. Jacob barely had time to react. His ear-splitting scream was drowned out by the roar of commands. "Drop the weapon! Hands in the air!" Jacob stumbled backward, blinded, raising the revolver instinctively as he searched for something to cling to. But before he could fire a shot, 2 officers tackled him to the ground, disarming and restraining him with such force that the wind escaped his lungs in a sharp gasp. "Clear!" came a voice from inside as tactical lights illuminated the small decaying cabin. That's when they found him, Vincent Russell, slumped forward in the chair. His wrists and ankles were bound with thick duct tape, his face gaunt from days of captivity. He didn't move at first, and for one terrifying moment, Graves thought they were too late. "He's alive!" shouted one of the medics as they moved in, cutting the restraints with practiced efficiency. Graves let out a long breath, his hand briefly pressing to his forehead. The aftermath, Vincent was airlifted to the nearest hospital within the hour, transported as a priority case due to his severe dehydration and malnutrition. The hovering press didn't take long to swarm the hospital, snapping photos of the ambulances and flashing headlines about the dramatic rescue. Graves allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. They'd gotten Vincent out, alive. But the job wasn't done. Back at the station, Jacob Dawson sat in an interrogation room, his shoulders slumped, his wrists in steel handcuffs. The man had cracked the second the officers pulled him from the ground. Graves stepped into the room, his face unreadable as he closed the door behind him. Well, Jacob began, his voice dripping with exhausted sarcasm. I guess this is where you tell me I've ruined my life. Graves pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down, leaning forward slightly. Not just your life, Dawson. You were the muscle, sure. But we both know you didn't mastermind this. So the question is, how much trouble are you trying to save yourself? Jacob smirked, though his eyes couldn't hide his fear. I talk. What's in it for me? You don't talk, Graves replied calmly, and all you'll see for the next 40 years are metal bars, a cell, and your own bad decisions staring back at you. There was a long silence. Jacob's smirk faded. Finally he exhaled sharply, almost like a laugh, and leaned back in the chair. Amelia, he said, bitterness dripping from her name. You think I dreamed all this up? No, she came to me, planned everything, made me the fall guy. Graves didn't react outwardly, though the confirmation sent a ripple of satisfaction through him. He already suspected Amelia's hand in this, but now he had the first undeniable thread tying the whole scheme together, and there was more to pull. Keep talking, he said. By the time the sun rose over the Nevada desert, Amelia Russell had no idea that her carefully constructed facade was crumbling. She had spent weeks cautiously spinning a story of grief and victimhood, but now, with Vincent recovered and Jacob turning against her, the neat little narrative she'd created was about to unravel piece by ugly piece. And Graves? He couldn't wait to deliver the final blow. The shocking confession. The interrogation room was a stark rectangle of cold steel and buzzing fluorescent lights. It was designed to break people, with no distractions, no comforts, just the relentless tick of the clock on the wall and the pressure of knowing there was no escape. Detective Michael Graves had spent more time in these rooms than he liked to admit, but he had learned one thing over the years. Everyone cracked eventually. Some quicker than others, and tonight he could already feel that Jacob Dawson was teetering on the edge. Jacob sat hunched over the metal table, his wrists bound in handcuffs that clinked every time he shifted uncomfortably. His shirt was still damp with sweat from the cabin raid, and his face bore the hollow shadows of a man who hadn't slept well, or at all, for days. His bloodshot eyes avoided Graves's steady glare, but the tension in his jaw and the way his hands twitched betrayed just how close he was to coming undone. Graves pulled out the chair across from him deliberately, the scrape of metal against concrete echoing through the room. He didn't sit down right away. Instead, he stood for a moment, watching as Jacob's foot tapped an erratic rhythm on the floor. The former cop was trying to act tough, but Graves could see through it. The man was hanging on by a thread. Long night, huh? Graves said casually as he finally sat down, leaning back in his chair like they were old friends catching up over a drink. Jacob didn't respond, his eyes fixed on a spot somewhere on the table. The silence hung between them like a loaded gun. I've been in this room with a lot of people like you, Jacob, Graves continued, his voice calm but laced with quiet authority. The ones who think they're in control. But let me tell you something. You're not. Not anymore. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table as he locked eyes with Jacob. The only thing you get to control now is how bad this gets for you. Jacob let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Yeah? And what happens if I just sit here and don't play your little game, huh? You gonna pull out the good cop routine? Offer me coffee and donuts? Graves smirked. He liked when they got cocky. It meant they were scared. I don't need to offer you anything, Jacob. You've already given me everything I need. He tossed a file onto the table, letting the papers inside spill out slightly. Traffic camera stills, cell tower pings, photos of Vincent tied to the chair in the cabin. You think I'm bluffing? These don't look like a bluff to me. Jacob glanced at the file but didn't reach for it. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, Graves thought he might dig in. But then he saw it. The subtle shift in Jacob's expression, the flicker of panic in his eyes. It was small, but it was there. I wasn't the one who came up with it, Jacob muttered, barely loud enough to be heard. Graves leaned closer, keeping his tone low and steady. Go on. Jacob hesitated, his fingers tapping against the edge of the table. For a man who'd been trained to navigate high-stress situations, he was unraveling fast. Look, he finally said, his voice rough. You already know she's involved. What the hell are you waiting for? Arrest her! Who's she? Jacob? Graves asked, though he already knew the answer. He needed Jacob to say it. Don't play dumb, Jacob snapped, his voice rising. Amelia goddamn Russell. He spit the name out like it burned his tongue. She's the one who came to me. This whole thing, it wasn't my idea, it was hers. Keep talking, Graves said, his tone firm but calm. He didn't flinch, even as a rush of satisfaction rippled through him. Jacob sighed, slumping back in his chair like the air had been punched out of him. She called me out of nowhere, all right. Told me Vincent had been screwing her over for years, hiding money, cheating, said she wanted him gone. But divorce? Nah, that wasn't enough for her. She wanted him out of the picture, permanently. Graves crossed his arms, sitting back slightly. And you just went along with it, just like that? Jacob glared at him, the bitterness in his eyes dark and heavy. She didn't give me a choice. You think I wanted to babysit some rich asshole in the middle of the desert? She dangled a payout big enough to wipe out my debts, get my life back on track. Said it'd be clean, easy, no one would get hurt. He let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Yeah, real easy. And the ransom emails? Graves asked. She wrote them, Jacob said quickly. Came up with the whole thing. She even brought me a burner phone so nothing could be traced back to her. But let me tell you something, detective. She's a lot smarter than she looks, calculated, cold. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You've been talking to her, right? Watching her crocodile tears on the news? She's so good at it, isn't she? Makes you want to give her a medal for acting. Graves didn't respond, his face unreadable. He flipped open the file again, pulling out a timeline of Amelia's movements before Vincent's disappearance. We've got her near the Nevada border 2 weeks before Vincent went missing, he said. The cell tower records place her less than a mile from the cabin. Of course they do, Jacob said bitterly. She scoped out the whole thing before I even got involved. Picked the spot, set up the supplies, all I had to do was follow her orders. So why flip now? Graves asked, narrowing his eyes. If she's so smart, why throw her under the bus? Jacob's mouth twisted into a grim smile. Because she was never going to let me see a dime of that payout. I figured that out about 3 days into this shit show. Amelia doesn't share. She was going to leave me hanging the second the heat got too close. He leaned back, spreading his hands. So here I am. You want her? Take her. But don't expect her to come quietly. When Jacob finally stopped talking, the room settled into an oppressive silence. Graves stood, gathering the file and the recorder he'd placed on the table. Without looking back, he said, We're done here. For now. As he left the room, his mind was already spinning with next steps. Caleb Dixon, the assistant district attorney, was waiting outside the observation window, his brow furrowed. How solid do you think it is? Caleb asked. It's not just solid, Graves said. It's a goddamn landslide. Think she'll run? Graves paused, his lips tightening into a thin line. If she knows what's coming? Yeah, she'll run. The question is, how far? He pulled out his phone and dialed his team. Get surveillance on Amelia Russell immediately. I want her locked down. Phones, banks, movements. If she so much as breathes differently, I want to know about it. As he hung up, he allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The net was tightening, and for once, luck seemed to be on his side. Amelia Russell's perfect life was about to come crashing down in spectacular fashion, and Michael Graves was going to be the one who brought her face to face with the truth. The trial of destiny. The courtroom was a crucible, buzzing with the kind of energy that only came from a high-profile case. Press photographers lined up outside the courthouse at dawn, their cameras poised to capture a single fleeting glimpse of Amelia Russell as she arrived in a sleek car escorted by her legal team. Inside, drama unfurled as spectators filled the wooden benches, shuffling impatiently for the trial to begin. Amelia, immaculately dressed as always, sat at the defendant's table. Her signature poise hadn't faltered yet. Her dark blazer and pencil skirt exuded confidence, while her hair was pinned neatly back to showcase her high cheekbones. If she was worried, she didn't show it on the surface, but Detective Michael Graves, seated in the back of the courtroom, saw past her polished exterior. He could spot the tiny cracks, a faint tapping of her finger against the table's edge, her eyes darting toward the jury more than was natural. She was a woman who had spent her adult life cultivating control, but now that control was slipping away bit by bit, and everyone in the room knew it. The prosecution wasted no time. They came armed with piles of forensic evidence, financial records, and the star testimony of Jacob Dawson, now the state's cooperating witness. Assistant District Attorney Caleb Dixon was as sharp as they came. With his crisp suit and piercing voice, he carried himself with the weight of a man who knew he had luck, preparation, and the truth all on his side. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Dixon began, moving deliberately across the floor, his voice clear and weighted with intention. This case might initially seem like a simple story of a husband abducted and held for ransom, but as we peel back the layers, it becomes clear that the mastermind of all of this isn't some faceless criminal, it's the woman sitting right over there, Amelia Russell. All eyes in the courtroom turned to Amelia, who met the attention head-on with a slight shake of her head, a subtle rejection of Dixon's words. It was exactly what any juror would expect from someone accused of a crime of this scale. Calm defiance. But Graves, still watching from the back, could see it for what it was. Theater. "Mrs. Russell isn't just your typical grieving wife," Dixon continued, emphasizing the irony in his tone. "She's a brilliant, calculated woman who constructed an elaborate scheme to rid herself of her husband, Vincent Russell, and seize control of their combined financial empire in the process. Today, we're going to show you how she orchestrated every single piece of this plot down to the last email." With every sentence, Amelia's hands gripped the edge of the table tighter. Dixon called his first witnesses, detectives from Graves' team who walked the jury step by step through the investigation. "The traffic camera footage here," one officer testified, pointing to an image on the courtroom screen, "shows Mrs. Russell's vehicle traveling toward the Nevada desert just days before Mr. Russell's kidnapping." The image drew murmurs from the gallery. This wasn't just speculation, it was visual proof. Another detective described the ransom emails in painstaking detail, showing metadata that traced the origins of the messages back to a burner laptop tied directly to Amelia. Each layer of her careful planning was peeled back like an onion, exposing the raw truth underneath her cultivated image. But the real blow came when Jacob Dawson was led into the courtroom. Jacob was a mess. His orange jumpsuit was loose on his wiry frame, and his face carried the sallow exhaustion of weeks spent in custody. He refused to look at Amelia as he was sworn in, but Amelia's icy gaze bore into him nonetheless. Whatever warmth or camaraderie they may have shared during their collaboration was gone. In fact, you could almost feel the venom radiating off of her as he took the stand. "Mr. Dawson," Dixon began, pacing deliberately, "why don't you tell the court about how you got involved with Mrs. Russell?" Jacob exhaled sharply, rubbing his wrist where his handcuffs had once been. "She came to me. I hadn't heard from her in years, and all of a sudden, she calls me out of the blue. Said she needed a favor." "And what kind of favor was that?" Dixon asked, tilting his head slightly. Jacob glanced over at Amelia, his lips curling into something between a smirk and a grimace. "She wanted me to help her make her husband disappear." Murmurs broke out in the gallery, but a sharp rap of the judge's gavel silenced them. "And did she describe why she wanted this done?" Dixon pressed. Jacob leaned forward, his voice dripping with bitterness. "Oh, she had her reasons. Said the guy was cheating, hiding cash. She made it sound like he was the scum of the earth, but let's be real, she didn't hate him because of any of that. She hated him because he wouldn't let her have total control." Amelia visibly clenched her jaw at the statement, but she remained seemingly calm, her face like stone. Graves watched her carefully, marveling at her restraint even as the evidence against her stacked higher and higher. The courtroom grew tense as Jacob recounted the details of the plan, the burner phones, the location of the cabin, the ransom scheme, and how Amelia assured him no one would get hurt. "But that was a load of bull," Jacob said flatly. "She didn't just want him out of the picture, she wanted him gone. If I hadn't messed up, if the cops hadn't caught me—" He paused, shaking his head. "Vincent wouldn't be sitting here today." The jurors stared at Amelia, their faces unreadable, swallowing every word. When it was her turn to testify, Amelia took the stand against the advice of her defense attorney. She had always believed she could talk her way out of anything, and to her credit, her performance was compelling. She painted herself as the victim of a fragile marriage, a wife who endured years of psychological manipulation and abuse by a controlling husband. Her voice broke at just the right moments, and she managed to shed a tear or two for sympathy. For a moment, even Graves could sense the jury wavering. Vincent's testimony, however, crushed the illusion. When he took the stand, weak but composed, he peeled apart Amelia's narrative piece by piece. He spoke plainly about her obsessions, the need for total control, her ambition that consumed their marriage. "She's brilliant," he admitted, his voice heavy with resignation. "But that brilliance turned toxic. Everything had to be her way. She made it clear that if anyone stood in her path, they wouldn't stand for long, even me." If that wasn't damning enough, Emily, their teenage daughter, delivered the final blow. Her hesitant but truthful testimony revealed Amelia's cold calculation behind closed doors. "She told me not to worry about Dad," Emily said, wide-eyed and visibly shaken. "But then, I overheard her on the phone during the ransom stuff. She wasn't scared like a normal person. She was planning." The courtroom fell into a hush so thick it felt suffocating. Amelia's attorney did what he could, but the weight of the evidence crushed every argument he attempted to make. As the final closing arguments were delivered, Dixon left the jury with one last thought. Mrs. Russell didn't just plan the crime, she perfected it. She used her charm and charisma to fool everyone around her, and now it's time to hold her accountable. When the jury returned with a verdict, the entire room held its collective breath. The foreman stood holding the slip of paper with the decision. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant guilty. Amelia's composure finally cracked as the words echoed through the courtroom. She reached out briefly, as though to grab the table for balance, but the bailiff was already locking her handcuffs into place. She stared at the ground, refusing to look up, even as the press outside began their manic scramble for headlines. Graves watched silently from his seat in the gallery. The case was closed. Justice had been served. Yet, as he walked out into the bright sunlight beyond the courthouse steps, he couldn't shake the faint feeling of unease. Amelia Russell may have lost her empire, her freedom, her family, but Graves couldn't help but wonder how long it would take for someone like her to plot her next move. The darkness of greed. For the Russell family, the courtroom verdict was the final punctuation in a story that should have never been written in the first place. The once perfect image of Amelia and Vincent Russell, the suburban power couple with everything anyone could ever dream of, was now irrevocably shattered. But as Detective Michael Graves sat in his car outside the courthouse the morning after the sentencing, staring blankly at the reporters crowding the front steps, he couldn't shake the weight of what this case had revealed. What drives someone to destroy everything they have? Graves murmured to himself, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't need to ask. He'd seen it countless times before, in fraud, in murder, in embezzlement. The motive was almost always the same: greed. When Amelia first came into focus as a suspect, the media painted her as a woman scorned, perhaps desperate. But as Graves sifted through the pieces of her life, it became clear that Amelia Russell wasn't desperate in the way people assumed. She wasn't driven by heartbreak or revenge. No, her motivations were darker, far more insidious. Greed wasn't just a flaw for Amelia, it was a belief system. People like her can't let go of control, Graves said during a late-night conversation with ADA Caleb Dixon after the trial. Dixon, exhausted and leaning heavily on his office chair, nodded. She craved it, needed it. Hell, lived for it, Dixon added, swirling his third cup of stale coffee that day. She wasn't satisfied being half of a power couple. She wanted to be the power. And when Vincent stood in her way, her husband, he became an obstacle, not a partner. The truth was chilling because it wasn't obvious at first. Amelia didn't walk into her marriage plotting Vincent's downfall. She wasn't some femme fatale from the start. She built her ambition brick by brick, the way she built her restaurant empire, the way she calculated every move in her perfect life. As long as Vincent played his role, things went smoothly. But when his success overshadowed hers, when his decisions threatened her autonomy, she didn't crumble under the pressure like a normal person might. She thrived in it. Amelia's transformation into a woman capable of masterminding her husband's abduction was not sudden. It was incremental, slow, calculated. Graves often thought back to one particular moment during her trial, when Emily, her daughter, gave her damning testimony. She always told me that successful people don't wait for others to hand them things, they take it, Emily had said, staring at her mother but refusing to cry. There was a haunting maturity to her tone, one that struck deep with everyone in the room. I didn't know what she meant back then. I thought it was about working hard at school or winning awards, but it wasn't. It was something else. Those words lingered with Graves for weeks. He knew kids often idolized their parents, blind to their faults until the cracks appeared. Amelia had taught Emily to be ambitious, but she had accidentally shown her something darker, the cost of unchecked greed. Sometimes, Graves told Dixon later, halfway into a drink at a dive bar, greed isn't about money at all. It's about power, the need to control. Amelia didn't need more wealth. She already had enough of that to last 5 lifetimes. What she wanted was the satisfaction of knowing that she owned everything around her. Dixon nodded, though his exhaustion was plain. Control is an addiction for someone like her. The money, the businesses, they're just trophies. What mattered to her was that she could take them from Vincent when she wanted. She wasn't content to share the spotlight. She had to be the only one standing in it. Graves took a long sip of his whiskey, the amber liquid stinging as it slid down his throat. And now look at her, she had everything, he said, shaking his head. The family, the career, the respect, and for what? 1 moment of satisfaction? 1 moment's all it takes, Dixon replied grimly. Vincent too was left broken in more ways than one. Though time would heal his physical wounds, The betrayal stayed with him. In a rare post-trial interview with a news network, he spoke for the first time since the ordeal, his voice raw and heavy with emotion. "Every night, I replay it in my mind. The signs I missed, the moments I could have done something different," Vincent said quietly, sitting stiffly in his seat. His usually commanding voice shook. "But more than anything, I try to understand why the woman I loved, still love in some ways, would think I was the enemy." The interviewer, visibly uneasy, pressed, "And do you think you'll ever find that answer?" Vincent's lips tightened, his eyes unmistakably weary. "Greed changes people, and sometimes the person they become isn't someone you ever knew to begin with." Graves watched the clip later from his precinct desk. Though he was rarely one for sentiment, something about Vincent's raw honesty struck him. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was the loss of an image, an ideal. "The American dream," Graves muttered to himself, turning off his monitor. "That's what this whole mess is about. Everyone wants it so bad they don't notice when it becomes a nightmare." Amelia herself refused to grant interviews during her sentencing or imprisonment, but the whispers from those who knew her painted a troubling picture. Even behind bars, she seemed more concerned with manipulating her image than processing her downfall. She wrote letters, long lyrical monologues, to friends, former colleagues, even strangers who had written about her in online blogs. "She's trying to spin it," Graves told his team one day, poring over photocopies of the letters. "Even now, she doesn't see what she did as wrong. In her mind, she failed not because she tried to ruin Vincent, but because she didn't succeed." The Russell case became a cautionary tale almost overnight, sensationalized by the very media that had once celebrated the family as the epitome of success. Op-eds dissected the moral rot beneath the shimmering exterior of wealth. Talk show hosts debated whether ambition was inherently toxic, or if the toxicity stemmed from those who wielded it. For Graves, no philosophical debate was necessary. To him, the case had been simple. "People like her think they're above the rules," he said once during a press briefing, "but greed is a slow poison. It doesn't just hurt the person drinking it, it destroys everyone around them." He paused briefly, watching the reporters scribble down his words before adding, "And Amelia Russell? She poisoned herself a long time ago. All we did was step in before she took anyone else down with her." As for Emily, she faded into the shadows after the trial, shielded by Vincent from the media's unrelenting glare. Graves couldn't help but think of her sometimes, wondering what kind of person she would become after enduring such public and private betrayal. Would she inherit her mother's ambition, or would she learn from the darkness of Amelia's greed and forge a different path? It was a question that would linger unanswered for years to come. In the end, the Russell story was remembered not for the crime itself, but for what it represented, an unforgiving portrait of how unchecked greed and ambition could twist even the most successful lives into tragedies. And as Graves flipped through the case file one final time in his quiet office, he knew this wouldn't be the last case of its kind.